say about this phenomenon of psychological essentialism. And in particular, I'm going to be talking about the way that psychological essentialism can help to illuminate certain problems in social psychology. So the idea is that people think of certain things as having essences, and that maybe if we think about how people understand this notion of essence, it can help us understand certain things about how human beings think about each other. So in particular, I'm going to be talking about two sorts of ways in which this phenomenon, psychological essentialism, sort of bears on social kinds of questions. So the first is this notion of individual essence, the notion that individual human beings have essences. So the thought here is that there are all sorts of things about you, but that in particular, there's some aspect of you that constitutes something like your true self, who you really are deep down inside. So broadly speaking, the thought might be that we have all sorts of different beliefs and desires and emotions and values, but that these aren't all equal. Rather, people seem to conceive of some of these beliefs and desires and values as constituting something like your true self, who you really, really and truly are. And then other beliefs and desires and values that you might have as somehow being a part of you, but not being part of your essence, not being part of your true self. So then the question we want to understand now is, how do people ordinarily make this distinction? So how do people ordinarily figure out which aspects of you are part of your true self and which aspects aren't? Then the second kind of notion I want to be talking about is the notion not about how people think of the essence of particular human beings, but of how they think about the essence of whole social categories. So here we're taking on a slightly different puzzle, and the puzzle is how people think about category essence. So the key phenomenon to start out with is that people seem to think of some categories as having essences, they essentialize some categories, but they don't essentialize others. So if you think about, say, how human beings think of gender categories, there seems to be a lot of evidence that people essentialize gender categories. They think there's something like an essence of being a man, or an essence of being a woman. But then if you think about other categories that human beings fall into, like, say, residents of the state of Connecticut, people don't think there's some kind of like Connecticut state resident essence. So now the key question we want to ask is, how do people draw this distinction? So how do people decide which kinds of categories have an essence and which kind of categories don't have an essence? What is it that distinguishes these different kinds of categories? So in research on both of these topics, I think you see, broadly speaking, the same kind of structure arising. The structure is that people are taking these very general theories about how human beings think about essences from cognitive psychology, from cognitive development, from philosophy, and then they're importing them into these problems in social psychology in order to understand certain social phenomena. So what I say in this talk is that if we look more carefully at these social phenomena, we can see something going on that's sort of broader than what you might have expected. That when you look at how people think about essences in these social phenomena, you're going to find that there's something broader going on, something beyond what you might initially have thought people were doing. And then maybe that's going to shed light on these much larger questions about how people think about essences more generally. So that's basically what's going on. And now I'm just going to dive in to talk about each of these topics separately. So before I do that, I just want to say, instead of just speaking all the way through for, say, 45 minutes in a row, I'm going to just talk about one of them and then stop. And then we can have a sort of discussion about that. Maybe people have questions or new hypotheses or ideas for further studies. And then after we finish discussing it, we can go on to the next one. And then the sort of end of the talk plus the end of all the questions will be at the usual time, an hour and a half from now. So let's begin with individual essence. And here, when we're talking about some work, I did with these folks. So George Knobe, Julian de Pretest, Kevin Tobia, and Paul Bloom. I guess the basic way that I think might be easiest to sort of start off talking about this is to give a sort of really classic example from the literature and philosophy that sort of illustrates this idea of human beings have an essence or a true self. So here's this classic example. So imagine a person who is a heroin addict. So the thing that he craves most of all is to just get another hit of heroin. That's one of the things that he most desperately wants. But now imagine that when this person starts thinking about his life, he starts thinking about what really matters to him in his life. He thinks that's not what he should be doing at all. What he should really be pursuing is something completely different. What he should be doing is trying to get clean, stop using heroin, start having a completely different life. So now, in this person's mind, there's a kind of conflict. On one hand, this desire to get another hit. On the other hand, this desire to get clean. And now, philosophers have often thought, we shouldn't think of these two desires as being just kind of on a par. That there's something really important about the difference between these two desires. So in particular, a lot of people have thought, if you think about this desire he has to get clean, that's somehow his true self calling to him. That's who he really is deep down inside. And then if you think about this desire to get another hit of heroin, that's also a desire he has, but it somehow seems to be more superficial. It seems to be like it's somehow not getting at his true self. So a lot of people might think, if he could just get rid of this desire, if he could stop having the desire to get another hit, then he'd be able to more fully express the person that he really truly was, always, deep down. So maybe in working on this question, we might think maybe ordinary folks have that same kind of intuition. And now we can ask, what is driving that intuition? So what is it that's differentiating these two things? What is it about this thing that makes you think that in some way it's the agent's true self? And what is it about this thing that makes you think it's not the agent's true self? And here we can sort of consider one sort of possible family of approaches. So there's a kind of broad family of approaches about this question that comes out of the work in philosophy that we can call reflectivism. So reflectivism is a kind of approach to this problem that was originally introduced by Harry Frankfurt, but I'm not going to be talking here about the details of Harry Frankfurt's specific theory, but more about the broad family of theories that this is part of. So the basic idea behind this view that I'll call reflectivism is that if you want to know which part of a person is that person's true self, you should ask which part of that person the person would endorse on reflection. So that I might have all sorts of beliefs and desires and values, but some of those are things that I have wholeheartedly, that when I think about myself, I endorse them. I think that's something good about me, that's something I want to hold on to. Other things about myself, other thoughts or desires that I have, when I think about myself, I completely reject them. I think, that's terrible that I have that, I wish I didn't have it at all, I regard it as in some way being alien to myself. And now you might think, that's the difference between these things that we regard as the true self and the things that we don't. Maybe the things that we regard as the person's true self are the things that that person would endorse on reflection. So now you can see how this broad family of views, reflectivism, would be able to account for the particular case we started out with. So what I would say is, consider his desire to get clean. That's the desire that he himself would endorse on reflection. If he was really thinking about his life, and he was thinking, you know, what is the good part of me? What's the part that I should hold on to? What's the part that I endorse? He would say, it's this part. And then it also explains why this thing is not his true self. And the reason is because he himself would reject it. Of course, he wants another hit of heroin, but he feels kind of alienated from that. He wishes he didn't have that at all. It's a part of him that he himself wishes he could get rid of. So this is one possible way of solving this problem. But now I want to introduce a completely different way, a totally different way of addressing these issues. And this is a family of approaches we might call evaluativism. So the idea of evaluativism is that when participants are trying to understand what someone's true self is, the participants themselves make kind of value judgments about that person's true self. So if you want to know of all aspects of myself, which is my true self, the way that you do that is that you think about which aspects of me really are the valuable ones, the good ones. Which things are the things that I should sort of hold on to? And which things about me are just kind of worthless, things that we should sort of put aside. So coming back to this example, the idea would be that you might think, this is the good part of this person, the part of the person that we should cherish and hold on to. This is the bad part of the person that you'd be better off without. So maybe it's that fact that you think that's the good part of the person that is driving your intuitions in these cases. So before we move onward, I just want to give you, again, a sort of clear sense of the contrast between these two views. So the key difference is that on this reflectivist view, when I'm trying to understand which part of you is your true self, the way I do it is by trying to think about which aspect of you would endorse on reflection. Which is the aspect of you that you would hold on to. By contrast, on this evaluativist view, when I'm trying to figure out which aspect of you is your true self, the way I do it is that I actually, myself, make a judgment about which part of you is the valuable part, the good part, the part that's sort of worth cherishing and holding on to. Of course, you might disagree with my judgment, but the judgment that's driving my intuitions about your true self is my own judgment, my judgment about what really is valuable to you. So if we look now at this example, this classic example from philosophy that we started out with, we see that in that example, and also in many examples that philosophers have explored, these two theories make exactly the same predictions. Why? Because the part of the self that this agent himself endorses is also the part that you are going to find to be the good part of him. And then similarly, the part of the agent self that that the agent himself would reject is also the part that you would find to be bad. So if we want to understand which of these two views is right, we have to look at a different kind of case. Not a case like this, where they make exactly the same prediction, but a case in which the predictions of the two views are going to come apart. So to address that, we looked at this case. So a case of a real human being. His name is Mark Pierpont. And Mark Pierpont was, at one time, a really important figure in this evangelical movement to cure people of their homosexuality. So he would travel around the world, and he'd be bringing to people this message, that homosexuality is a sin, but that you could be cured of that sin through the power of Jesus. And in particular, he would suggest that, so in particular, he sort of taught people that through this sort of Christian approach of prayer and seeking forgiveness, you could lose these desires that you had within yourself. But Mark Pierpont actually had this problem. The problem was that he was actually gay. So this thing that he felt, this desire that he felt within himself, was one that he himself completely rejected. So he thought that this desire that he had was something really bad about himself. It was something that he wanted to reject completely, something he wished that he could rid himself of. The attitude that he had about this aspect of himself was maybe similar in certain ways to the attitude that this classic heroin addict in the philosophical example has toward his desire to get another hit of heroin. So Pierpont sort of went through the struggle within himself about these various issues for a while, and then eventually he ended up leaving the church and actually just got married to another man. So now, the key question we want to ask now is how to characterize Pierpont's self at the time before he left the struggle. At the time that there was still this conflict within himself, how should we figure out which aspect of him is his true self? So if we went with this classic kind of philosophical view, reflectivism, then what we should say is that his true self is the part of himself that's drawn toward this Christian view that homosexuality is a sin. Why? Because when he thought about himself, when he would reflect on his own self and think about what was most valuable to him, he very clearly endorsed this part of himself and completely rejected the other part. Now, by contrast, suppose that we took this evaluativist view. Then the prediction would be more complex. What we predict is that it depends on what your own judgments are about this case. So if you thought that this was the good thing, that this part of him that's seeking to rid himself of these homosexual desires is the good part of himself, then you regard that as his true self. And by contrast, if you thought the part of him that's drawing him toward being with another man is the good part of himself, you'd think that was his true self. So people with opposite kind of moral views would have correspondingly opposite views about the nature of this person's self, the nature of which part of him was really most essential to who he is. So to get at this issue, we ran a simple study in which people were randomly assigned to one of two conditions, and participants in one condition got this case. Mark is an evangelical Christian. He believes that homosexuality is morally wrong. In fact, Mark now leads a seminar in which he coaches homosexuals about techniques they can use to resist their attraction to people of the same sex. However, Mark himself is attracted to other men. He openly acknowledges this to other people and discusses it as part of his own personal struggle. And then we wanted to know what people thought within this story was Mark's true self. So we used a number of different DVs, but one DV was just using these kind of egg yolk diagrams that I used earlier to just illustrate the nature of the theory itself. So participants received a forced choice from one of four options. One was, deep inside, Mark is drawn to, is this feeling within Mark drawing him to be with other men? But then at a more superficial level, there's this belief he picked up that that's morally wrong. The other is, deep inside is his belief that this is morally wrong, but at a more superficial level, there's this emotion he has somehow that's drawing him to be with other men. Or they're just both really superficial, or they're both part of his true self. So before we move on, let's just run the experiment on you. So, people understand? There are sort of four options. Could just think for a moment about which is the right one. Okay, how many people think it's this? The feelings drawing him to other men are his true self. How many people think it's this? The belief that it's morally wrong is his true self. Either is his true self, or both are his true self. So in addition to this DD, we also had this individual difference measure, and the individual difference measure is just one item long. So it's just, would you describe yourself as a liberal or a conservative? And so we can now look at the results on the true self question broken down by political orientation. So if you now look at judgments among the liberals, what you find is that the modal response is that the feelings are his true self. The modal response among liberals is that these feelings drawing Mark toward being with other men, that's his true self. By contrast, the modal response among conservatives is both. Both the feelings and the belief are part of his true self. In other words, everyone agrees that his feelings are part of the true self, but those participants who are most likely to think that this belief is morally wrong say it's not part of his true self, and those participants who are most likely to think that the belief is morally good, they think that it is part of the true self. So of course, there's also another condition. In this other condition, people just got a story that was the reverse story of the real Mark Pierpont. So in this story, participants were told, Mark is the secular humanist. He believes that homosexuality is perfectly acceptable. In fact, Mark leads a seminar in which he coaches people about techniques they can use to resist their negative feelings about people who are attracted to the same sex. However, Mark himself has a negative feeling about same-sex couples. He openly acknowledges this to other people and discusses it as a part of his own personal struggle. So people look up, and now we just have the same questions. So you might think, deep down is his feeling of disgust at gay people, but then his belief in equality for people of all sexual orientations. That's just some superficial thing he picked up. Or deep down is his belief in treating equal treatment for people of all sexual orientations, but then there's just these weird feelings he has. Or both of them are just some weird superficial thing, or both of them are part of his true self. Okay, there you go. Okay, how many people say this? How many people say this? This? And this? Okay, so we can once again break down the results by political orientation. What we find now is among the liberals, the modal response is both. That is to say, they think both those feelings and the beliefs are part of his true self. By contrast, if you look at the conservatives, the modal response now is that it's just the feelings that are part of his true self. That deep within Marx's true self are these feelings drawing him toward the response that being gay is morally wrong. But then there's just some weird beliefs he picked up from today's politically correct culture or something that sort of go against those feelings. So what you see again is that both participants of both political orientations think that the feelings are part of the true self, but those participants who think that the belief is morally right tend to say that it's part of the true self, and those participants who think that the belief is morally wrong tend to say that that same belief is not part of the true self. So what you seem to be seeing is this effect of our moral judgments, of our own beliefs about what's morally right and morally wrong, on our judgments about which aspects of another human being is essential to that person. So we started out with these two kinds of views, Reflectivism and Evaluatism. And what we seem to be seeing so far is that we're seeing some evidence against this reflectivist view. In fact, if anything, we're seeing evidence that goes in the opposite direction. Other things being equal, when you have a belief and you have some feelings that are going against that belief, people tend to think that the feelings are the true self and that the belief is not. So of course, in most cases, other things aren't equal, because in most cases, when a participant has a certain belief that something's morally wrong, and feelings that go in the opposite direction, in most cases, we're going to think the beliefs are the morally good part of that person, and that the emotions are not the morally good part of the person. But when we control for your actual moral beliefs about this case, people think that the reflective part of you is actually less part of your true self. Then the second thing, and the thing that I really want to be emphasizing here, is the second fact, that people's own moral evaluation seems to be playing a role. Whichever part of the person you regard as being the good part of the person, you seem to be taking that part of the person and regarding that part as the person's true essence, is what's really at the core of that person's being. So in further studies, we tried to explore this a little bit further. I'd be happy to talk about other studies that we did, but I just want to give you just a quick tour of some of them. So one thing we did is just a bunch of other studies, they just went after the same basic effect, but using slightly different methods. So one of them, for example, was a study in which participants were told about an agent who changed in a certain way. So they switched from A to B, and now participants were just asked, what do you think explains that change? Was it that they just happened to change? Some people change. Or was it that there was something calling them toward B always, all along? And then when they seemed to switch from A to B, that's when their true self emerged. And what we seem to find is that people say that second thing, specifically in those cases where they regard B as being the morally good thing and A as being the morally bad thing. So when you think that the person is switching in a direction toward being morally good, you think their true self is somehow emerging. When you think they're switching in any other direction, you don't. Then secondly, we were worried, maybe this effect is just due to the kind of sunny optimism of American culture. Maybe Americans just have a tendency to try to look on the bright side of everything. So what we try to do is to translate this into other languages and then look at whether people from other cultures show the exact same effect. And what we found across a number of different cultures was no difference at all between cultures. Everyone thinks that the morally good part of you is your true self. So for example, we translated into Russian, and the famously despondent, misanthropic Russians still say that the true self of every person is the part of that person that is morally good. So then speaking of misanthropy, we looked at an individual difference measure of misanthropy. So this is the faith in people scale reverse scored. So some people seem to regard human beings as being really terrible, really think that human beings generally are really bad. So we want to know now would that moderate our effect? So in general, what we're finding is this effect of valence, that if something's morally good, you see that more as the true self than if something's morally bad. Now, if we take this individual difference score in misanthropy, is that going to moderate the effect of valence on people's true self judgments? So the way we did this is that we told some participants about someone who's conflicted. So they're partly drawn toward one thing, partly drawn toward another thing. And then we asked between subjects two different kinds of questions. Some participants were asked, so here's this one thing, there's this bad thing and this good thing. What do you think the person's going to do? Just predict. When they're in this conflict, they could do the bad thing, they could do the good thing. Which thing are they going to do? Then other participants were asked a different question. They were told, here's this conflict. Part of the person is drawn toward the bad thing, part of the person is drawn toward the good thing. Which is that person's true self? Which is the thing that that person really, most truly is deep down inside? So just as you might expect, there was a significant effect of misanthropy on predictions. So the effect of valence on prediction is moderated by misanthropy in just the way you'd expect. So these highly misanthropic people say that you're going to do the bad thing. When you're conflicted between the good thing and the bad thing, you're going to choose the bad thing. By contrast, for the true self judgments, there was no effect at all of misanthropy. So even the most highly misanthropic people are still showing a significant effect that they think whatever is the morally good thing within you, that's your true self. Of course, they think you're not going to act on that true self, so you're still basically a terrible person. But what makes you so terrible isn't that you don't have a good true self. What makes you so terrible is just that you're not going to act on the true self that you have. So let's just sum up everything we've seen so far. So we're trying to understand now what people regard as the essence of particular individuals. There are all sorts of different traits within us. Which traits within us do people regard as essential to us? And what we seem to be finding so far is this effect of value judgment. That people seem to say, of all the traits within me, whichever are the really good ones, those are my essence. Whatever are the really bad ones, those are just some things that happen to be inside of me, but not as essential to who I most fundamentally am. So that concludes the first section. Yeah?
So, curious about a possible sort of, I don't know, possibly,
yeah.
Is that, at least in English, and I don't know about Russian, but I know Dostoevsky makes the comparison between good and true.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And so consequently, it may be the case that when you ask somebody who is the true self, or what is the true self of this person, you're effectively asking the phrase, true self could effectively mean, what is the good part of this person? What is, rather than asking what is essential to this person, you could be asking what is good about this person.
You know, that's a really helpful point. And in the study in which we asked about the true self, I could definitely see that point really explaining all the results. So we tried to get around the issue in two different ways. I mean, I definitely agree that it is an issue. So one is just, in the 3 studies we report in this paper, in each study we use a different way of just phrasing the question about what the true self is. So in one, it does use the phrase true self, and in that case it's a word. But in the other case we ask which characteristics belong to the person deep down. So this metaphor of being deep down doesn't in quite the same way seem to refer to it's not like down somehow conveys good. If anything, it seems to convey bad. It seems to much more tap into this metaphor we have of the essence as being the thing that's somehow inside someone, whereas the non-essential things are on the outside. And then the second thing we did was in the paper that I think a lot of you read for today, we ran a whole series of studies where we were trying to argue that these true self-judgments mediate the impact of valence on all sorts of other things. So on those other studies that we were trying to make sense of, the original effect of valence on the DV doesn't involve anyone using the phrase true self in any way. So people just get some questions about happiness or moral responsibility, and then you see an impact of valence on all of those DVs, and then that impact turns out to be mediated by the judgment of the true self. But in the original case, where people were just getting the original judgment, no person even used the phrase true self or any synonym for it. It just seems like people just have this essentialist way of thinking about these questions that we use in any case. But yeah, did you want to follow?
No, sorry, I didn't longer, but it seems to me that the way to address this sort of concern is to ask people, what is the essence of this person? So, for instance, my impression for the essence of most people, everybody as a whole, is that we're creatures that are flawed, but we have good ideals, right? We, try to pursue things that are good, but we aren't exactly the best at it. I make no ascriptions to, either of those being the true self. In fact, I would argue, it seems like a lot of people are of the same mind that the beliefs and feelings both belong to sort of the central self, because that's where I say.
We didn't do any studies in which we actually used the word essence in the experimental materials. So the reason we did that is just because we don't think people usually use this word. I mean, it's the word that we use in our theory, but we don't think it's a word that people use ordinarily. But something we did that much more directly taps into this notion of essentialism is to look at judgments about whether it would be you after a certain change. So suppose Jim has some really good things and some really bad things. Now, suppose he lost all of the bad things and only had the good things. Then people tend to think, it's still Jim, just like a more awesome version of Jim. But then, by contrast, suppose he loses all the good things and he keeps all the bad things. Then people tend to have this view, it's not even Jim anymore. Jim is just gone. And so you see there a pattern of response that seems to much more directly tap into this notion of essence. If you think of the essence as that thing about you, such that you couldn't, it's necessarily true of you, you couldn't even be you without it, then what we seem to be getting is that the good things about you are essential to you in the sense that if you lost them, you wouldn't even be you anymore. The bad things about you, if you lost them, you're still you, just better. Yeah?
Are you worried about demand effects? So if I was a subject that really thought that there were people that were evil to the core, that had bad things of their essence, I probably couldn't live very long going around espousing that and acting on it. So I might learn to compensate and say, oh well, I need to paint this rosy picture, otherwise I'm gonna.
See, I completely agree that in most of the early studies we did, this problem of demand characteristics is a huge problem. So the way that we tried to get around it was using this misanthropy measure. So on this misanthropy measure, it's just people are just making explicit judgments about whether human beings are good. And of course there are demand characteristics pushing you towards saying that the human beings are good. But some participants go against that. They just say, human beings are terrible. They're just the worst. Like, when you better watch out for them. They're going to do anything they can to harm you. Then we can look at those participants, the participants who explicitly say that human beings are just really bad and not to be trusted. What did they choose on this true self measure? And they still say that the true self is good. So it seems like there is a legitimate problem of demand characteristics, but even those participants who are willing to just overtly say terrible things about humanity, they're still showing these original effects. Yeah?
So in neuroscience, there's a long-standing set of evidence that tries to separate the notion of liking something, liking a stimulus or liking an experience, and wanting something. And the wanting instantiating action. So just bringing up this line which is relevant for this sense of evaluation. So in evaluating something, even in my true self, you are going to evaluate things you like, or that the liking, I would say, would probably have a would be seen as something that is truly things that you want, like that you want to get cleaned up, and of course, heroin is a classic example for this wanting response. So, the actions this person goes, and this is sort of constraining their sort of free will. Like, these are the things that they have chosen to do, like grab water when they want to drink water and things like that. And that's just part of what ends up being who they are, right, in their actual actions. But then if they take a moment to evaluate what about their actions they like, then suddenly they have this completely different judgment and the way that and that could.
Wait, so I think other things being equal, if there's a conflict between liking and wanting, people are going to think liking is the true self more than wanting.
Yeah.
It's a great suggestion. So the point that we were trying to make is just that orthogonal to that, there's just this effect that whichever thing you think is the good thing about the person, you're going to think that is the true self. But of course, there could just be two different main effects, right? It could be that there's a main effect of liking versus wanting. We always think liking is more the true self than wanting. And there's also a main effect of good versus bad. And then they can just sort of both be playing a role. I had never thought about this until now, but I do kind of get that idea that if you imagine if you just imagine something that someone wants but doesn't like, and something else they like but don't want, wait, that sounds really funny. Like, say you just met someone and they were like, I'm trying to decide what to major in. There are these two things that I'm wondering about. On one hand, I'm thinking this because I really want to take classes in that. But whenever I take those classes, I don't like them. There's this other thing where I don't want to major in that at all, but when I take those classes in that, that's the thing I really like. So which is the person's true self? I definitely, it's a great point. I really feel like you're right, that people think your true self is revealed more by the liking than by the wanting. Yeah?
If you have any resistance to the overall metaphor, if there is a core version of this?
Oh, yeah.
Okay, because I was wondering if there would not be a fifth option there where it's just all blue. inside the circle?
Oh, so first of all, I want to emphasize, just in case, I hope it's obvious, but nothing about this project presupposes that the human beings really have essences. I mean, obviously, when we're doing cognitive science, I mean, we don't have that in our theories. It's not like, and no one has any theory where they're like, there are two parts of the mind, the essence and the non-essence. What we're trying to do is understand how people think about these questions. So
I'm wondering if people wondered if they thought in those terms at all.
Right. So the first thing to notice is, if people thought that everything about you is really essential to you, then they can just answer this way. And if they thought nothing about you is really essential to you, we can just answer this way. So there are response options that are available to those people. But the most important thing to emphasize is this other methodological point, which is that we get this on people's explicit responses if you just ask people, what is someone's essence, and then make these judgments. But the real sign that people are thinking in this essentialist way is not the explicit responses that you just ask people, what's the essence, and they say something or other. It's that there are these other questions that are not at all questions about essence. And people give these seemingly mysterious answer responses to these other questions. And then we could show that people's essentialist judgments about the self are mediating the impact of their moral judgments on the answers to those other questions. In other words, in times when people have no idea that they're doing anything essentialist, they just look at this question and they think something or other is the answer to it. Their judgments about that question seem to be explained by this essentialist judgment that they themselves might not endorse. So, speaking for myself, if someone asks, do you really think human beings have essences? I might say, no. But then if you just give me one of those other cases, I might have this immediate intuition about that. And that intuition that I have might be driven by this essentialist thinking that I might reject on reflection. Maybe one more question. Jeff.
So I'm just wondering how much this carries over from these results about individuals and carry over to essences of inanimate objects. So if the Dorito is crunchier, then it's more of a Dorito, but if it's soggy, it's just not a Dorito anymore. I have the intuition that it's still a Dorito instead of
sorry. We do think it carries over to Doritos, but it's important to understand what is the relevant judgment about the Dorito, right? So the judgment you're talking about is the judgment of what we might call category membership. It's consider this thing, is it a Dorito? But that's not what we're interested in. We're interested in judgments about the essence of this thing. Not judgments about whether it falls into the category of Doritos, but about this thing that we just have in front of us. So we ran a study in which we did this exact thing, but not with human beings. And so we just did a whole variety of other kinds of objects. So one of them was a physics paper, one of them was a conference, one of them was an organization, one of them was a house, all sorts of different things. And then for each of them, we asked, say it has these good qualities and the bad qualities, and it loses one, either the good qualities or the bad qualities. Would you say it's not even that thing anymore? So we said, imagine this physics paper, and it has some parts of it that are really helpful and really help to address these important problems in physical theory. Then other just dreck that was added in to appease the reviewers. It doesn't really help with anything at all. Now, suppose you would remove one of those things. So say you remove all the dreck. Now the paper's half as long. It only has the good parts left. Will you say it's not even that paper anymore? The paper is gone. It's been replaced by another paper. Now suppose you remove the good parts, but you just keep the dreck. Then will you say it's not even that paper anymore? The paper is gone. And what we should find exactly the same pattern across all 8 domains, all 8 different kinds of inanimate objects. And that is just that people think the essence of all of these objects is the good part. So in other words, what seems to be going on is that there's a fact that we find for the self, that people think the true self is the morally good part of the self. It doesn't seem to be anything about the self per se. It seems to be just this very general phenomenon that we have for thinking about essences, and then we apply it to the self. Okay, one more thing, and then I'll go.
It's just that brings up a really interesting sort of question, which is that how many people actually do respond with a sort of essence-based approach? Because as you were expounding on the ideas of is it still the same paper, I felt like neither of those are the same paper. I mean, you are definitely by changing the overall structure and the paper, you change the paper, right?
You know, I feel bad, but the way we do these studies makes it impossible to answer your question because we just do them all between subjects. So say that I asked you, do you think it's the same paper? And you're judging on a scale from 1 to 7, how much do you think it's the same? Say you say 3. Then the only way that we could know whether you're giving this sort of essentialist judgment is what you would have said in the other condition, whether it would have been higher or lower than 3. But we don't know that because we do it all using this between subject design. But I think it's extremely plausible just as you say that there are individual differences, whereby on the whole we're getting this effect, but that effect is being driven by some subclass of our participants, and then there are other participants who aren't showing the effect at all, and then it just comes out exactly. So with that, we're moving on. So far we talked about individual essence, the essence of particular individuals, and now I'm shifting, I want to talk about essences of whole categories. So ultimately, I wanted to talk about this larger theory we developed of category essence, but first I want to talk about some work we did on a very specific class of concepts, so a very particular kind of concept, and hopefully it will provide a window into this much larger phenomenon. And this is some work that I did with these folks, so Sandeep Prasada and George Newman. So we're interested in these concepts, like consider the concept scientist. So if you think about scientists, you might think we can associate this category with certain features, like scientists do experiments, they do statistical analyses, they have theories, they write papers, and so forth. But now you suppose you start to think, so what is the essence of being a scientist? What is really essential to being a scientist? You might think the essence of being a scientist isn't just like something like having all the features on this list. Rather, you might think all of these features are ways of realizing some kind of deeper value. Maybe something like the impartial quest for empirical knowledge or something. Then you might think it's really that's somehow the essence of being a scientist, not just having that whole list of different features. Or consider the concept of poetry. So people might associate poetry with various features. You might think, I don't know, poems sometimes rhyme, they sometimes have meter, they have verses, tend to have stanzas. But then if you thought, what is the essence of poetry? What does it really fundamentally mean to be a poem? You wouldn't think the essence of poetry is just having all of the features on that list. You might think there's some deeper thing that's really the essence of being a poem, and what that deeper thing is some kind of deeper aesthetic value, some value that you can realize by having all those features. Then you might think it's that aesthetic value that's really kind of the essence of poetry. So what we're thinking then is that these particular class of concepts have something that we're going to call a Platonic essence. So the structure of Platonic essentialism that we're talking about has this kind of structure. It's that there are concepts associated with a whole variety of superficial features, but then people think those superficial features aren't themselves the essence of the category. Rather, the essence of the category is some kind of value that you can realize by having all those features. And it's really that value that is the essence of the category. So we wanted to study these concepts with Platonic essences. So in order to do that, we wanted to have a whole bunch of Platonic concepts that have these kind of essentialism, and then a whole bunch of control concepts, so that we can then do a series of studies that compare the Platonic concepts to the control concepts. So to do that, we wanted to put together a pretest that helps us to sort of get some Platonic concepts and some control concepts for the real studies. So in this pretest, we just took 50 different concepts, and for each of the 50, we asked people a question of the following form. So we said something like, imagine that someone says, he is a friend. And now imagine that another person says, I completely disagree. That person is not really a friend at all. In fact, if you think he's really a friend, I would have to say that you have some fundamentally wrong values. And then participants were just asked on a scale of 1 to 7 to rate the degree to which it made sense for the second person to invoke the notion of values in trying to decide, say, whether someone is a friend. So for this category of friend, the answers were very high. People tend to think that values make a lot of sense in this case. But now consider other ones like opticians. Suppose someone says he is an optician, and says, I completely disagree. That person is not really an optician at all. In fact, if you think he's really an optician, I would have to say that you have some fundamentally wrong values. So that, as you can imagine, got very low scores. So now we can take the concepts that have the very highest scores, and we're going to refer to those as the Platonic concepts, and the ones that have the low scores, those are control concepts. And then what we want to do is we're going to run a series of studies in which we compare these concepts, the Platonic concepts, to the control concepts. So the first thing we did is that we just asked whether in each case it makes sense to add the word true to say a true X, where X is one of these categories. So suppose that we try this now with Platonic concepts. You could say something like a true friend, true love, a true artist, a true scientist, a true soldier. And then we just ask participants on a scale of 1 to 7 to rate for each of these concepts. Does it make sense to use the word true with it in this way? And then we try the same thing for the control concepts. So there's be like a true second cousin, a true firefighter, a true waitress, a true blog, a true optician. And then, as you might imagine, what we find is a significant effect whereby people think that true makes more sense for the Platonic concepts than it does for the control concepts. So people think it makes sense actually in both cases to say good. So you can say something like a good waitress, just as you can say something like a good artist. You can say a true artist, but you can't say a true waitress. So this seems to be providing at least some initial evidence in favor of the hypothesis. So if you thought that somehow the way that people are understanding these is that there's this deeper thing, this essence, then maybe what true is intended to do is to pick out the idea that someone has this essence. So when you say someone is a true scientist, what you mean is, it's not just that they have the superficial features of a scientist, they have this deeper essential characteristic of a scientist. You can't say something like a true blog, because there is no deeper essence of a blog. What it is to be a blog is just to have those superficial features. But the real test of this essentialist hypothesis is to look at cases in which something has all these features, but doesn't have the essence, and then to ask all those cases, do people think that that thing is a category member? So if something has all the features associated with a category, but it doesn't have these values, then is it really a member of the category at all? So we tried this, for all of the Platonic concepts and all of the control concepts, and we did it just by giving people little vignettes about each. So say for a scientist, we would tell people, imagine this person who does run experiments and run statistical analyses and has some theories and writes papers. But now, imagine that this person is not in any way trying to advance our empirical quest for knowledge. Instead, this person's only concern is with just like trying to get a lot of grants and like get tenure. Then, is this person really a scientist? So, okay, try to really picture this person. So this person is doing all that stuff. You know, she's a professor, she's writing all these papers, she's doing experiments, but none of this stuff is really in any way advancing our quest for any real knowledge, and she's not even trying to engage in the quest for knowledge. She's just trying to have all these features for some other reason. And now the participants were asked two different questions. So first they were asked, would you agree that there is a sense in which this person is a scientist? And second, would you agree that ultimately, when you think about what it really means to be a scientist, you'd have to say that that person is not truly a scientist? So let's just try it right now. How many people think there is a sense in which this person is a scientist? And how many people think that ultimately, when you think about what it really means to be a scientist, you have to say that this person is not truly a scientist? So then, the second kind of concept we looked at were these kinds of control concepts. So participants would be given a concept like blog, and they'd be told, okay, imagine this thing, and it has posts and comments, it's on the internet, it has links and so forth, but it has none of the values that we normally treasure on blogs. It's not in any way up to date, informative, witty, anything you might hope for in a blog is just completely lacking. And then participants were asked these two statements. Again, do you think there's a sense in which this thing is a blog? And do you think ultimately when you think about what it really means to be a blog, you'd have to say that this thing is not truly a blog? So how many people agree there's a sense in which this thing is a blog? And how many people think ultimately, when you really think about what it is to be a blog, you have to say that this isn't truly a blog? So if we look now at judgments for these control concepts and judgments for the Platonic concepts, then for the control concepts, we find something relatively straightforward. People think the member statement is true, so this thing, there is a sense in which this thing is a category member, and they think that non-member statement is false. So they think it's not the case that ultimately there's a sense in which this thing is not a category member. In other words, what sort of the basis of their judgments in the control concepts is these superficial features, not these deeper values. If something has these superficial features, then regardless of what's going on with these deeper values, just simply is a category member. By contrast, in the Platonic concepts, we find this really striking pattern of results. What we find is that people agree with both of these statements. They both agree with the member statement and with the non-member statement. So what that means is they both think that this person is a scientist, so there's clearly a sense in which this person is a scientist, but they also think that ultimately, when you think about what it really means to be a scientist, you'd have to say this person is not a scientist. So what we're seeing here for these Platonic concepts is this trademark evidence of this kind of dual part structure, what we call a dual character concept. So there seem to be two different criteria associated with each of these concepts. On one hand, there are these superficial features, and we are judging whether something is a category member in terms of them. If something has these superficial features, we think there's some sense in which it clearly is a category member. Then on the other hand, there are these deeper values which seem to constitute a kind of essence associated with the concept. They don't seem to play a role in the criteria for category membership too. So if something doesn't embody those deeper values, we think that even if it does have all the superficial features, there's some deeper sense in which it's actually not a category member. So that concludes the second part of the talk. Yeah?
So a colleague of yours, Kyung An, did some work looking at categories of psychiatric diseases, where the official diagnostic and statistics manual says you have this disease if you have these superficial features. But upon interviewing psychiatrists, she found that they had complex causal networks, including things that were unseen, and actually were making diagnoses based on their best guess of whether these unseen causes were there. So with that in mind, do you think this is largely a matter of cause, that the core things down here at the bottom are the things that caused the other features?
All right, this is super helpful. So Ukiang and many other people argue for the notion of what's called causal essentialism. So the idea of causal essentialism is that there's some hidden factor, something that we could never maybe really understand, that's causing all of the superficial features, and that we regard that hidden cause as being the true essence. So I think that these people are completely right about all the categories that they were studying, but we wanted to suggest is that these categories, the categories that we've been looking at, are different. In that in these cases, we also have these superficial features in this essence, but the relation between the superficial features and the essence is different. In fact, it's almost the opposite. So suppose that you were looking at something, you're trying to figure out whether it's a poem. It's just like a bunch of words. Now, imagine that the way this bunch of words was created was just, I don't know, say it was just a random quantum mechanical accident. It just burst into being. So clearly, it wasn't, if you thought that the essence of a poem was something about how the poem was caused, then clearly this thing wouldn't have that essence. But now, if you actually looked at the words in the poem, you could ask yourself whether it has this essence. So you could, if you look at these words, you could say, does this have that deeper thing that makes something a true poem? And maybe you might think in some cases that it does. So in this sense, what we seem to be seeing is a kind of explanatory relation between the features and the essence that's exactly the opposite. It's not that the deeper value associated with poetry causes the poem to have these features. Rather, it's like, if you look at the actual words that are written in the poem, something about those words being there and being in the arrangement they are is realizing this deeper aesthetic value. So we're trying to figure out whether the poem has whether this thing that's written down is a true poem. We're not thinking what caused those words. We're thinking, do those words realize this deeper value? And if they do, then we might say this truly is a poem. Yeah.
So I'm wondering if what people are doing is essentially some kind of dimensionality reduction, right? Yeah. So you're given a set of traits, yeah, and then you try to classify which one is this. So it reminds me of these sort of BuzzFeed things that are ubiquitous, right? So what state are you? And you answer a set of questions and they'll say, you're California. Right? So essentially if you look at the algorithms behind how they do this, it's essentially saying, what is the likelihood that you would have given these answers? You know, so it's like saying, what is a person's personality? So it really comes down to saying, these are the traits, and this is the essence, which is the largest, say, principal component of those traits. And in the second case, I think what you're showing in terms of what the essentialism really is that you've got what the principal component is, and then you want to try and extract some kind of features from it. Do you think that's a sort of accurate way of...
You know, I really think it is. So the basic idea, that it's kind of like principal component analysis, is the suggestion that you start with a bunch of features, and then there's just a list. You have like 12 features or something. Then the way the human mind works is in that we think, ultimately what it is to be what this category, what constitutes the nature of this category is that list, the 12 features. That's not how people think. What people do is they think, sort of, why those 12? Like, what is this deeper thing that explains that it's those 12 and not these other 15? And then what they really think constitutes the sort of essence of the category is that deeper thing. Not the list of the 12 that are in it and the list of the 15 that are not in it, but that sense of like this deeper sort of latent factor that's sort of explaining why it's those 12 and not the other 15. So in some cases, that thing that helps you understand why it's these features and not those is this causal thing. In other cases, it's this deeper value. But in any case, I think it results in the idea that our mind is kind of working like principal component analysis, like not trying to not have huge lists, but think about this sort of deeper kind of underlying factors that explain those lists. Yeah?
So I'm curious about the true scientist sort of experiment that you've run here. Because did you try manipulating so removing features rather than the values from the experiment, seeing if people judged it as less of a true scientist? So for instance, if the value of a true scientist is the pursuit of empirical knowledge, and the features of it are, qualified researcher in some regard, has a lab and does research, I would consider that, that's a pretty good model of a true scientist. But if you remove any one of those features, I would judge that as less of a true scientist than what is, regardless of whether or not it was the central value or one of these peripheral values.
We didn't do that, but the theory definitely predicts that that should not happen. So, I mean, if it does happen, that's bad. That shows that the theory is wrong. But so, what the theory predicts is that as long as you have this deeper thing, then you could lose any number, even all of those traits, and you could still be you could still be considered as sort of the true scientist. So, so suppose there were two people. One has this lab here. She's doing like work in material sciences or something. She's not actually trying to find the truth about stuff. All of her research is fundamentally flawed, and she's just trying to sell out to corporate interests. Now, I mentioned there's like some homeless guy out here, and he's just like he doesn't even know how to run a t-test. He has like no conception of any of that stuff, but he just genuinely has like just a deep interest in other people and trying to understand what other people are like. And so he just tries to like look at other people, like look at the people who are interacting with him, and then he tries to like really make sense of them in this deep way. And he's just involved in a really sincere effort to like understand other people and what makes them tick. Whenever he gets any evidence against one of the views that he had about other people, he's not at all dogmatic about it. He just immediately rejects that. He might not be very skilled at this, but he's like really trying to do his thing. Then that person has absolutely none of the features that we would sort of ordinarily associate with a scientist. He's never finished high school or ever can't do math, but the suggestion is that if the theory is right, people should say, that guy, that's the true scientist, not the person who has all of the sort of traditional features. And maybe I'm also similar, I could say, my daughter who's 3 years old, she's like more of a true scientist than all these people who are just getting published in Nature or something. So, of course, my daughter doesn't have the features that would be associated with scientists. You wouldn't say she's a good scientist. She doesn't know how to do all those things, but she has like this deeper quality, that deeper quality that you would realize by having all those features. Yeah.
So I'd love to hear your thoughts on the standard response in your field to experimental philosophy, because I'm just really interested in hearing it from you. Because I guess one possible response from some other more traditional folks in the field would be that philosophers who study essentialism or talk about essentialism are thinking of essence subscript 1, right? And this is very interesting, but it's essence subscript 2, namely what people tend to do in specific circumstances under these sorts of conditions. But there might still yet be something like essence subscript 1 that is sort of untappable using methods like this that you can only do through sort of careful reasoning, through philosophical methods and so on. So I just wonder how you see the potential interface between essence 1 and essence 2 and how this work.
Right. So I forget which one was 1 and 2. One is the one with the.
One's the true one.
Yeah. So the aim of all this work was to get at essence 2. And then all of this work was published in straightforward psychology journals, and it doesn't talk about these other issues. But even though we didn't do this work for the purpose of illuminating this issue that you call essence 1, I think that despite the fact that that wasn't the main goal of this work, it might actually help to illuminate some of those questions. So if you think about, for example, existing philosophical work on the true self, a lot of that work proceeds by sort of appealing to your intuitive judgments about cases. So the philosopher will say, consider the following case. Now, given that case, surely you have this intuition. And I think they're right. The intuitions that they say we're supposed to surely have, I think we do have those intuitions. But now, as we begin looking at the underlying cognitive processes that drive those judgments, we come to have a better understanding of why people have the intuitions that they do. And I think if you have an understanding not just of the pattern of people's intuitions, like in the case of the heroin addict, their intuition is that his drive to get clean is his true self, but also of the underlying cognitive processes that make people have that intuition, say that it's because they think his drive to get clean is the good part of him. That can in some cases make you sort of question the sort of philosophical judgments that you had. So you might start to think from a certain perspective, oh, maybe this really isn't providing evidence for the philosophical theories that we thought it was providing evidence for. Now that we understand that it was driven by that kind of cognitive process. Is there one more thing, or should I go? Go for it.
So, what really makes something like the Platonic concept versus control? Like, so it's intuitive to me that this would be culturally dependent. Like maybe I don't have a good idea of what a true hunter is, but there are definitely people in society that do have a sense of a true hunter, and I wouldn't be it, right, or something like that. Yeah, or even the cashier sense. Maybe I don't know, Martin Heidegger would say the cashier can be. There is a cashier that believes he should be a cashier and is the true cashier sense. So these concepts would be cultural. What things are seen to be essential, or essential and independent of having all of its sub-features would be dependent on your experience.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So the claim is that what makes people see certain things as Platonic concepts and other things not as Platonic concepts is the following thing. It's that when you learn about the concept, you learn that it has these certain features, and then as you look at those features, if you think there's some kind of deeper value that all of those features are allowing you to realize, then you're going to think of it as a Platonic concept. And if you look at all the features and you think there's no deeper ideal that all of these things are allowing you to realize, you're going to think of it as a control concept. So there could be two individuals who associate the concept with the exact same features, and they learn about the concept in the exact same way. But if one has the view that all of those features allow you to realize some deeper value, that one will think of it in this Platonic way. And if the other thinks, that's just a random list of features, that doesn't allow you to realize any kind of deeper value, that one will not think of it as Platonic. So we can test this idea by just giving people novel concepts. So the way we did it was, we just gave people concepts, and the way we did it was not by showing them that it had this structure, but just by giving them a list of features. So we said, here's this concept. Daxers are just people who have all these features. And then, in some cases, when you look at the list, you can kind of see that all of those features were ways of realizing a certain value. In other cases, when you look at the features, you just think, it's just like a bunch of features. And then, all of the things that we've seen associated with the sort of naturally occurring Platonic concepts, if you look at these novel concepts that we just invent and just give to the participants, as soon as they see this list of features, if they see that, that there's some deeper ideal that it can be seen as realizing, they show all those effects too. So they think, if you don't have the deeper ideal, people say there's some sense in which she's a Daxer, but ultimately when you think about it, what it truly means to be a Daxer, it's not really a Daxer at all. Okay, with that, we're moving to the next section. So at the very beginning of this talk, I suggested there's this really important finding in social psychology that people think of some kinds of categories as having essences, and some categories not. So people think that, for example, if you think about gender categories, there's kind of something like an essence of being a man or essence of being a woman. And then if you think about some category, like say being a resident of Connecticut, there's no sort of Connecticut resident essence.
Nutmeg is not an essence?
What?
Nutmeg is not an essence. Sorry, terrible.
So now, in light of all this stuff that we've just been talking about, maybe we can return to that question. So what is the difference? What's the difference between these two kinds of categories? So a traditional thing that people often say is that the difference is that some of these kinds of categories are seen as being rooted in our biology. So people think that there's some sort of deeper biological thing about us that makes us men or makes us women, but there's no deeper biological trait that makes you a Connecticut resident or not a Connecticut resident. Maybe that's the difference between the essentialized categories and the non-essentialized categories. That some of them are seen by people as being biological and other ones not. So if you thought that was right, it would help you to understand all sorts of different categories. So gender categories are essentialized. It would also help you people make sense of why people essentialize racial categories, why people maybe essentialize categories involving sexual orientation, maybe many other things. But then we started to think, maybe this isn't providing a full picture of the categories that people essentialize. So maybe there are other kinds of categories people essentialize other than those categories. So take the category of being a Christian. So you might think there's something like an essence of being a Christian. That being a Christian isn't a category like being a Connecticut resident. But if you think about what that essence is, the essence of being a Christian isn't like some kind of Christian biology. It's something different. Rather, the essence of being a Christian seems to be some kind of Platonic essence. It's this deeper value that the various features you associate with being a Christian are supposed to realize. Something like humility, compassion, forgiveness, and similarly with many other categories. So you might think there's like an essence of being a punk or an essence of being a hipster, but you don't think there's something like hipster genes that make hipsters hipsters. And whatever the essence of being a hipster is, it's not going to be something rooted in hipster biology. It's going to be some different kind of essence. So now, in thinking about this notion more broadly, I think we can sort of make a more complex conceptual distinction. So on one hand, there's clearly a difference between categories like gender categories and categories like being a Christian, that people see these kinds of categories as biological, and they don't see these kinds of categories as being biological. But then both of those kinds of categories differ in turn from categories like, say, being a Connecticut resident. So these categories are seen as having different kinds of essences, a sort of biological essence versus the Platonic essence. But then both of those are in turn different from a category like being a Connecticut resident, which isn't seen as having any kind of essence at all. So we wanted to test that hypothesis. So the way we did it is we looked at a whole bunch of different social categories, and then we asked participants a series of questions about all of these categories. So the way we did it is that each participant just gets a single question, and each participant is answering that question about all of the different categories. And then we're using the categories, not the participants, as the units of analysis. So we calculate the mean for each question for each category. We're doing all the analyses on those means. And in particular, what we're using is factor analysis. So you have a whole bunch of different categories, and you have a bunch of different questions. And then we're factor analyzing to discover these sort of latent factors that explain the answers to a bunch of different questions. So let's look now at these questions. So first, with a bunch of questions, they were supposed to get at the issue of sort of whether something is seen as having an essence at all. So the appearance reality question said, though X's have though Christians have similarities and differences on the surface, ultimately what it means to be a Christian is to have a deeper characteristic that all Christians possess. Or the deeper similarity question, there is an essential quality or characteristic that makes Christians similar in some deep way. Or this knowledge deference question, people have a certain view about what makes someone a Christian. But philosophers and scientists have thought a lot about this and concluded that ultimately there's something much more fundamental which makes someone a Christian. And then we also had questions that were supposed to get in some way at what sort of essence something had. So the scientific cause question, it would be possible for scientists to identify the unique biological characteristic that causes someone to be a Christian. The biological essence question, the essence of being a Christian is something biological. The value-driven question, the essence of being a Christian is embodying a certain kind of value. The true member question, can you say that person is not a true Christian? If you think that person is the true Christian, then you don't really know what it means to be a Christian at all. So then in addition to looking at these social categories, we also wanted to look at certain categories that are already relatively well understood so that we could use this kind of anchors to compare the social categories to. So we looked at a whole series of different ordinary natural kind categories. So these are the kind of categories that a lot of existing work on causal essentialism has already investigated, and we have a pretty good understanding already of how people essentialize these categories. And then we looked at all the Platonic categories and all the control categories from the previous study. So we can now look at all of these different questions, and what we find is that factor analysis yields a two-factor solution, and the two factors work basically as follows, that there's one factor that all of these three questions load on, and then a second factor that these two questions load on positively and these two questions load on negatively. So more or less, it seems like what we're getting is a certain factor. It's the first factor that's sort of general essentialism, sort of the degree overall to which people essentialize this category. And then the second factor, which is which type of essence this category is seen as having. So to the extent that it's a positive number, it's seen as having this kind of more biological essence. And to the extent that it's a negative number, it's seen as having more of this value-driven essence, an essence that has something to do with realizing certain values. So what we can do now is if we look at the factor scores for each item, we can plot those factor scores on this sort of two-dimensional space and get a kind of visual representation of how these different items are being rated. So the first thing we can do is, if you remember, we had a bunch of different sort of general categories of items. So all the natural kinds, all the Platonic categories, all the control categories, and so forth. Instead of looking at each of those items separately, we can just take the mean factor scores for all of the items in each category. And what we get now is this. So first of all, we see this difference between the natural kind items and the control categories, which is a difference that's already been very well understood from existing studies. Clearly, people think that there's a difference between something like a natural kind and something just like being an optician. So in some sense, people seem to be essentializing natural kinds in a way that they're not essentializing categories like optician. But now the key thing to notice is that once you start looking at the Platonic categories, this other sort of dimension of difference emerges. So it's not just that the natural kinds are different from the control categories. Rather, there's one way in which the natural kind categories are like the Platonic categories in that they're both essentialized and thereby both different from the control categories. But another way in which the natural kind categories are really quite distinct from the Platonic categories in that the natural kind categories are seen as having this distinctively kind of sciencey, biological essence, whereas the Platonic categories are seen as having this essence that's more constituted by something about values. So now, using these kinds of things as anchors, we can look at all of the social categories. And what we find now is this, that some social categories are seen as basically natural kinds. So people think that, say, gender categories have these essences that are just the same as the kind of natural kind categories that we study in folk biology. And some social categories are seen as having no essence at all. So people think that there's no essence to being a comedian, there's no essence to being a golfer, there's no essence to being a soccer mom. But now we also see this other kind of category, other sort of type of social categories, which are these Platonic social categories. These social categories that are seen as having an essence, but aren't seen as having this kind of sciencey, biological sort of essence. So categories like being a Christian, being a hippie, being a punk, people think that those categories do have an essence, but the kind of essence they have isn't the kind of essence natural kinds have. Rather, since we have this Platonic essence, people think what it is to be a Christian is to embody a certain sort of essence, and that sort of essence is to realize in your life certain kinds of values. So now, it seems like what we're seeing is that there's this sort of abstract structure that can be found both in the cases of the natural kinds and in the case of the social categories that's making us see them both as having essences. So in the case of biological essentialism, it seems like what we see on the surface is a bunch of different features, and then we think all of those features are sort of unified in some way because there's this one underlying sort of hidden cause that's explaining all of them. So this essence is sort of unifying all the different features of being a man or being a woman, and it's unifying them all because it's some hidden thing that causes all of those features. And then in the case of Platonic essentialism, what we're finding is that very same structure with a different sort of content. It's that we have a bunch of different features, and then we think that all of those features are ways of sort of realizing or embodying these same underlying traits, which are these underlying values. Okay, that concludes our third section. Yeah.
So, is there, I guess, a question about everything? Are we in that stage, or are we just in the third stage?
Oh, I was in the third stage, but we could transition to the
no,
next
okay, that's
section.
fine. I'll wait.
Do people have questions about social categories? Yeah.
Well, quick one. I wasn't quite clear. Could you go back to the chart?
Yeah.
So there's no essential soccer mom,
Yeah.
and there's no essential English speaker.
Yeah.
But there's an essential New Yorker and
Yeah.
an essential female. Is that?
That's the result, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just check.
Okay, so you might disagree about whether there are essences of these categories, and then I just want to explain what the theory says about why people should think there's an essence. But you might think that you might think either that people are wrong in these cases, or that we're wrong about what people are saying. So what the theory says is that people should think there's an essence to these things if they think there's some deeper thing that all the superficial features we associate with those things are all ways of realizing. So if you think that, so take a category like punk, we associate it with all these different features. It's people who, I don't know, they like the dead Kennedys, and they have mohawks, and they like use skateboards. I don't know, just like you can think of all different kinds of categories associated with being a punk. And then if you want to know that there's a punk essence, what you want to ask is that just like a random collection of different features, just a whole bunch of different things? Or is there some deeper value that all of those features are ways of realizing it? Something about, say, rebelling against the system or something. Then if you take the category of Canadian, you maybe associate Canadians with all different things. They are really good at hockey, and you say a boot is supposed to value or whatever. Then you ask, or considering all of those different features, can we see all of those features as realizing some sort of underlying value? And then what the theory says is that you should say that something is more has more of an essence if the features seem like they're all ways of realizing some underlying value, and less of an essence if you can. Yeah.
So I wonder if you are worried about the data. I mean, isn't a soccer mom essentially a mom and eating a kid that plays soccer? And the people are rating it as not an essence at all.
Oh, see, if you look at the questions that we asked that are supposed to get at this notion of whether something has an essence, then they're very clearly phrased in such a way that the idea is that the essence is supposed to be something distinct from those features. So the idea of something having an essence, you might say, a Connecticut resident, there's clearly something as a necessary and sufficient condition for being a Connecticut resident, which is that you reside in Connecticut. But then people are going to say, in the way that we're talking about essence, that having a Connecticut resident, being a Connecticut resident doesn't have an essence, in the sense that there's no deeper thing that's distinct from just being a resident of Connecticut. So a soccer mom, clearly, in order to be a soccer mom, I don't know, it's necessary that you be a mom and you have a kid who likes soccer or whatever. But then the idea is that there's not some whole kind of way of life that you can embody that is distinct from being a soccer mom. Like say, if you say that, consider me, I'm not a mom and I don't have a kid who plays soccer. But could you say, yeah, but despite that, he has the true essence of being a soccer mom? I think, like, at least maybe participants can. But no, consider the concept of punk. Say you're talking about some ancient Greek person like Alcibiades or something. You could say, okay, you didn't listen to the dead Kennedys, but if you understand fundamentally what it is to be a punk, even though he lived, like so many thousands of years ago, he truly was a punk. And you can kind of understand what that means.
And you don't give these people any kind of training, right? They just get the questions and they're just forced to try to answer based on what answers.
Right, of course. Yeah. So we definitely don't give anyone any training. But I just want to emphasize that the nature of these questions, that these are the questions that load on the general essentialism chapter. And they aren't just, there are necessary and sufficient conditions for being a category member. There's this idea that there's something distinct from the surface thing, that is some deeper thing that sort of makes these things simple.
If you go back to the chart that you were just on, do you think that there is simply an overlap of interpretations for the words Jew, homosexual, Hispanic, or that something else is going on? Is there kind of occupying this mid kind of territory?
Oh, yeah. So if you notice what's going on, is we see for the categories that are on the right, there are a bunch of them that are higher in general essentialism than these ones that are lower. And then there are two kinds of hypotheses about what's going on with this difference between the ones that are higher and the ones that are lower. And one kind of hypothesis is that this reveals something really important about human cognition. But then another hypothesis is that it just reveals something important about political correctness. That people are much more okay with saying something like that there's an essence of being a straight person than that there's an essence of being a gay person. People definitely don't want to say there's an essence of being a black person. But it's not because of some core fact about human cognition. It's maybe just because of social desirability. To answer those very essency, to give high responses on those very essency questions for those kind of social categories is something that people would want to shy away from. But it could be, maybe you think there's some deeper thing going on. Yeah.
I might be trying to tease out what you mean by the central value. So what about the category of diseases? You might say that, this person has hepatitis C, right? And the properties, the symptoms are somehow connected to a central value of hepatitis C?
No, absolutely not. Sorry. No, exactly. That category that you just described is very well explained by existing theories of causal essentialism. So the way to understand what's going on in that category is the exact way that everyone always said you should understand what's going on in that category. It's that there's a deeper essence, which in this case is understood as some underlying cause. And that underlying cause is the essence. And then the question that now arises is, given that that's the right way of understanding that category, what is it about this underlying cause that makes it an essence? And one answer that people often give was that the essence of essentialism is something about this causation. Causation is sort of like the very essence of what makes something an essence. And then what we wanted to suggest is, it's true that in that case the essence is a cause, but that's not because it just lies at the very essence of essence to be a cause. So there's some essences that work this other way. So what really makes that cause, in that case the essence, isn't that it is a cause, it's that it unifies all the different features of someone who has hepatitis C. In some other cases, like say being a Christian, the essence of being a Christian isn't the cause of being a Christian.
So is it possible that the essentialism is just the degree to which we're comfortable using that thing as a label? So effectively, if you go back to the chart, we've got, in the upper left-hand corner, we've got Christian, Southerner, and New Yorker. Mm-hmm. And then towards the bottom, we've got English speaker, Canadian, and soccer mom.
Mm-hmm.
And at least Canadian English speaker and soccer mom aren't labels that I use in a day-to-day sort of, well, navigating the social world. However, I do describe people as hippies, punks, not too often Southerners, but I have had my run with a fair share of New Yorkers. And so it's a matter of the degree to which I'm comfortable making a group out of that.
Right. You know, it's possible that you're right. I mean, but that obviously the theory is the opposite of what you just said. So the theory is that people should be fine saying that some people are Merced students and some people aren't Merced students. And that could be really important for all sorts of things. Like, you know, people who are Merced students, if you're a Merced undergrad, you have to pay tuition to Merced. And if you're not a Merced undergrad, you don't have to pay tuition to Merced. It's a really important distinction. You can take Merced classes if you're a Merced undergrad, and you can't take Merced classes if you're an undergrad somewhere else. But then, even though there's that distinction between Merced undergrads and people who aren't Merced undergrads, that distinction isn't seen, we would suggest, as having an essence. That is to say, if you just think about all the different features that are associated with Merced undergrads, it's just a bunch of features. There's not some sort of deeper thing that makes you like a true Merced undergrad. So maybe a good test for the non-essenciness of Merced undergrad, or the category of Merced undergrad, is that if someone didn't have those features, there's no further thing that they could have that you say, okay, it's true they don't have the superficial features of being a Merced undergrad, but ultimately at some deeper level, they are a Merced undergrad. And then something like the category Southerner is supposed to be different. It's that even if you aren't in the South, you could still have this thing. Like and even if you are in the South, you could lack it. I mean, someone could live their whole life in the South, but someone who's from the South could say, okay, yeah, it's true he lived his whole life in Alabama, but when you think about what it truly means to be a Southerner, he's just not really a Southerner at all. I feel like, was there something? Yeah.
I think I'd just like to elaborate a bit, because what I've wondered is that if people will tend to make the cut on saying that basically what will count as something essential to them is something that will be connected with what will be a permanent part of their life. And so being Christian, yes, you adopt a belief system, but you say, I expect to be basically have my life guided by this belief system indefinitely, for the rest of my life, in fact. Whereas if I adopt the role, say, perhaps of the waiter, I said, well, I don't expect that to be a permanent part of my life, even if it turns out I'm in that career.
Oh, right.
And anyway, and New Yorker, similarly, I wonder if, there are some people who say, I'm so intensely proud of being a New Yorker because I don't think anyone should be allowed to live elsewhere. And I know people like that. But I think you and I actually overlapped for a year at UNC, and I can imagine there would be people who say, oh, there is such a thing as being a true Tar Heel. And there are people here who aren't true Tar Heels. They're just here because they basically, that this was the most affordable school, or because they couldn't go. But then there are the real Tar Heels, the ones who are utterly loyal to the university and who know everything about the.
Well, first of all, I should say, I feel like you're really right that there's this notion of essence that is incredibly closely tied to this notion of immutability. And I think that, although we haven't investigated it empirically, I think this notion of the true self might have exactly that quality. That one sort of core notion people have about your true self is this notion that it's in some strange way immutable. That is to say, you can change your appearance, but the way that these apparent changes are working is not that your true self really changed, but just that you're sometimes more or less embodying that true self. But at least I would think that this other thing, so that's just completely agree with what you just said, but I would think that this other thing, this notion of category essence, isn't really having the same flavor of immutability. That when you say someone is a category member in this deep, essential way, that where you think to be a category member really is to have this certain kind of essential quality of the category, that people don't think each individual human being has to be always in the category or out. So if you think there's something that is sort of the true essence of being a scientist, at least I think it makes perfect sense to say someone had that thing, the thing that is the true essence of being a scientist, up until he was 45, and then he lost it and became this sellout person seeking pop acclaim or something. Then you're not saying the fact that he became this person means he never really truly was a scientist before. He was truly a scientist. It's just that now that thing that is the true essence of being a scientist is lost to him. And I think maybe you could say the same thing about some of these other kind of social categories. But maybe I'm mistaken about that. In any case, there is a striking thing that if you just looked at this list, I think you would find that the categories that are high in general essentialism might be seen to be more immutable, and those lower much less so. So let me now just quickly conclude. So I just want to say, it seems like so far we've been looking at these two different phenomena. So one is this notion of individual essence, and there we're trying to understand what's the distinction between these things that are seen as sort of essential to the self, the core of the self, and these other things that are seen sort of superficial. And what we discovered is that the answer seems to have something to do with a kind of value judgment. We think that the good things are sort of at the core of the self, and these things that we don't really value are seen as sort of more superficial. Then we turn to look at category essence, not at the essence of you, but at the essence of various categories in which you might be considered to be a part. And there we seem to find that people think that one of the things that can be the essence of a category is, again, this kind of value, that a certain sort of deeper value can be at the essence of a category. So looking at these two things, it seems like there's some sort of really striking similarity between these two findings. It seems like it can't be a coincidence, that there's got to be some kind of larger theory about what an essence is, how psychological essentialism works, that's ultimately going to explain both of these two results. So far, we don't really know what that is, but we're still working on it. Thanks.